Kodak invented the digital camera. Kodak also led the US in digital camera sales in the 2000s. And Kodak still went bankrupt because of digital photography. That's not irony, that's a trap. And that same trap has killed more companies than bad luck, bad products, and bad timing combined. It even has a name. Once you know it, you'll see it everywhere. In December 1975, a 24-year-old Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson built a camera that took no film at all. It was the size of a toaster. It weighed 8 pounds. It took 23 seconds just to save a single blurry black and white photo. Sasson's manager had handed him a new type of image sensor and asked him to find a use for it. The prototype worked. Sasson showed it to Kodak's executives and walked them through the concept. He even predicted that within 15 to 20 years, digital image quality would rival film. The reaction, according to Sasson himself, was polite but dismissive. Interesting, but don't tell anyone about it. At the time, that wasn't unreasonable. In 1976, Kodak controlled roughly 90% of film sales and 85% of camera sales in the United States. By 1990, film was generating over 70% of the company's profits. A grainy 0.01 megapixel prototype that took 23 seconds per photo wasn't a threat to that. It was a curiosity. Kodak patented the technology anyway in 1978. Then they mostly left it alone. That decision, to sit on a threat instead of killing it or committing to it, is step one of the innovator's dilemma. Step two is coming. Here's where the popular version of this story, Kodak just ignored digital, starts to fall apart. Kodak didn't ignore it. They hedged. For nearly 2 decades, the company tried to have it both ways. Keep milking film for cash, slowly and cautiously explore digital on the side. That's the innovator's dilemma in its purest form. Any real investment in digital photography would cannibalize the film business, funding almost the entire company. Every dollar shifted toward digital was a dollar taken from the business printing Kodak's paychecks. The trap isn't stupidity. It's that the rational move in the short term, protect the cash cow, is the fatal move in the long term. So Kodak split the difference. They released their first consumer digital camera in 1995, nearly 20 years after Sasson's prototype, but marketed it half-heartedly. They still positioned film as the real product. Through the 1990s, they also diversified into unrelated ventures like pharmaceuticals and photocopiers, spending billions trying to find a second pillar of revenue instead of fully committing to the digital transition already happening inside their own labs. The clearest example, in 1988, Kodak spent $5.1 billion outbidding a hostile takeover from the Swiss pharma giant Hoffmann La Roche to acquire Sterling Drug, the maker of Bayer aspirin and Philips milk of magnesia. The logic, at the time, was that drugs had high margins and Kodak already made industrial chemicals, so the two businesses would fit. They didn't. Kodak had no real capability in drug discovery or generic manufacturing, and after 6 years of losses, they sold the pharmaceutical business off in 1994 for a fraction of what they'd paid. That $5 billion spent chasing a business Kodak didn't understand was roughly the same amount of capital that, deployed into digital imaging a decade earlier, could have changed the entire outcome of this story. Compare that to what Fujifilm, Kodak's closest competitor, facing the exact same collapse in film demand, did with its diversification instead. Fujifilm looked at its core expertise, not adjacent industries. They'd spent decades perfecting collagen chemistry to keep photographic film from degrading. That chemistry, it turned out, was directly transferable to anti-aging skincare. Fujifilm launched a cosmetics line built on the same antioxidant compounds used to protect film emulsion. It sounds absurd, a film company selling wrinkle cream? But it worked, because it wasn't a blind diversification chasing margins. It was the same underlying capability redirected. Kodak diversified away from what it knew. Fujifilm diversified sideways from what it knew. That distinction is most of the reason only one of these two companies is still a real business today. Kodak wouldn't get a second chance to make that kind of decision. But in the meantime, they were about to have their best years yet. And that's exactly what makes what happens after that so brutal. In the 2000s, Kodak actually did commit. And it worked for a while. By the mid-2000s, Kodak held the top market share in digital cameras in the United States. They weren't stragglers anymore. They had genuinely caught up. For the first time in this story, Kodak had actually done everything right, which is exactly when it stopped mattering. Here's the problem hiding underneath that win. Digital cameras were a fundamentally worse business than film ever was. Film was a razor and blades model. Sell the camera cheap, sell rolls of film and prints forever. Digital cameras were a one-time purchase with thin margins, and Kodak was competing against Sony, Canon, and Nikon. None of them carried a legacy film business to protect. None of them had any internal conflict about going all in. Kodak won a market that was structurally incapable of replacing the profits of the market it was destroying. That's the second half of the trap nobody talks about. Escaping the dilemma doesn't mean you're safe. It just means you've traded one unprofitable position for a different one. Then the market shifted again, faster than anyone's roadmap accounted for. Camera phones arrived. By 2008, they were mainstream. Kodak had just spent 30 years fighting the wrong war. The thing that actually killed them wasn't even trying to be a camera.
The speed of that shift is easy to understate in hindsight. As late as 2003, camera phones were a novelty feature buried in Japanese and Korean handsets. 5 years later, more camera-equipped phones were shipping every year than dedicated digital cameras. Not because phone cameras were better, but because good enough, always in your pocket, beat better, but you have to remember to bring it. Kodak had spent 30 years worrying about film versus digital. The device that actually finished the job wasn't a better camera at all. It was a phone that happened to have one. Digital camera sales, the business Kodak had just fought its way to the top of, started shrinking too. Not because film was coming back, because a separate device in everyone's pocket made standalone cameras less necessary altogether. Kodak was now fighting a two-front war. Film revenue collapsing on one side, the digital camera business it had just won was turning out to be a shrinking, low-margin market on the other. There was no third act waiting. The financial reality became impossible to hide. In 2011, Kodak stock fell more than 80%, bottoming out at 54 cents a share. The company brought in restructuring lawyers that September. By January 19, 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, listing $5.1 billion in assets against $6.75 billion in debt. In the aftermath, Kodak sold off more than 1,100 patents, many of them foundational to the digital imaging technology inside modern smartphones. Those assets sold for $525 million to companies including Apple, Google, Samsung, and Microsoft.
Here's a number that'll make you angry. Guess what those 1,100 patents, the actual technology inside the phone in your pocket, sold for? Now guess what Instagram sold for 8 months earlier, with no patents and 13 employees.
That price is worth sitting with. At the height of its power, Kodak's brand alone was valued in the billions. In bankruptcy, 1,100 foundational imaging patents, the actual intellectual property behind autofocus, image sensors, and digital compression, developed over decades by the company that invented the category, sold for less than the amount Instagram, a 13-person photo-sharing app with no patents at all, had been acquired for by Facebook just 8 months earlier. The market wasn't just rejecting Kodak's business model, it was pricing the entire category of owning the technology at close to zero. Because by 2012, the technology wasn't the scarce thing anymore. Distribution and attention were. The company that invented the technology powering the camera in your pocket sold off the proof of that invention just to survive. The popular version of this story is Kodak was too slow and paid the price. The real version is more useful and more uncomfortable. Kodak wasn't too slow. They were caught in the innovator's dilemma, attached to a business model that digital could never replicate, even after they'd mastered the technology and even after they'd won the market. Inventing the future isn't the same as being able to profit from it. Kodak proved they could build the technology in 1975. They proved they could even win the market in the 2000s. What they couldn't do was escape the trap. Find a version of digital photography that generated anything close to the profit margins of the razor and blades film business it was replacing. Because that business didn't exist to be found. It was structurally impossible.
The lesson isn't adapt faster. It's this. The innovator's dilemma doesn't punish companies for missing the future. It punishes them for correctly protecting the present. And no amount of internal innovation fixes a model that the market has already decided to stop paying for. Just ask Xerox and Nokia.
Kodak invented the future and still couldn't survive it. Next time, a company everyone laughed at for a business model that made 0 sense on paper, until it became worth more than Delta, the biggest airline in America.
Subscribe if you want to see the pattern before it repeats.
In January 2019, WeWork was valued at $47 billion. More than Ford, more than most airlines, a company that at its core rented office space. By September of that same year, 9 months later, that valuation had collapsed to around $10 billion. The IPO that was supposed to make its founder one of the richest men in the world was withdrawn entirely. He was forced out of his own company within weeks. This isn't a story about a bad business idea. This is a story about how one document was enough to unravel a decade of hype in a matter of days. WeWork was founded in 2010 in New York City by Adam Neumann and Miguel McKelvey. The idea wasn't new. Co-working spaces already existed, but the timing was sharp. The 2008 financial crisis had crushed office demand, and landlords were desperate enough to sign long-term leases with almost anyone. WeWork's model, sign long leases, renovate into stylish community-branded workspaces, sublease flexibly. In 2017, SoftBank's Masayoshi Son committed over $3 billion, pushing WeWork toward its eventual $47 billion peak. By 2019, it operated 800-plus locations across nearly 30 countries. WeWork's leadership sold the company as a technology, community, and movement, not a landlord, because tech companies get valued at far higher multiples than real estate companies. Neumann also held shares with roughly 20 times the voting power of ordinary shares, meaning no board vote or investor pressure could meaningfully challenge him. This combination, a story outrunning the fundamentals with no working governance check, let a string of extreme decisions go unchallenged, including a wave pool company, a children's education venture, and a private jet, all while the core business burned hundreds of millions a year. In August 2019, WeWork filed its S-1, the public IPO prospectus. For the first time, outsiders saw the real numbers, close to $1.9 billion in losses, Neumann's supervoting shares, and conflicts of interest, including leasing his own buildings back to WeWork. The valuation collapsed within days, from $47 billion toward $10 billion. On September 24, 2019, Neumann stepped down as CEO. The IPO was withdrawn days later. He exited with a severance package worth over $1 billion, while roughly 2,400 employees lost their jobs. WeWork went public again via SPAC in 2021 at a fraction of its old value, then filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in November 2023 with about $19 billion in debt. It emerged restructured in 2024. A valuation built on narrative instead of fundamentals can survive indefinitely until it's forced into daylight. And a board that can't say no isn't a board, it's an audience. WeWork's supervoting structure let every bad decision go unchecked for nearly a decade. The company didn't die because office space was a bad idea. It died because the story outran the numbers, with nobody positioned to stop it. Next week, a company that had the right technology at the right time and killed itself anyway by refusing to believe its own product was already obsolete. Subscribe if you want to see the pattern before it repeats.
Ryan tuned constantly, the same way an airline tunes the price of the seat itself. The parts of the experience that feel like random cruelty are underneath some of the most carefully engineered pricing in the entire industry.
Right now, this week, a company that spent decades disrupting cable television is collapsing under the weight of a newer disruptor. 3 separate divisions of the same corporate empire have filed for bankruptcy in the span of about 5 weeks. This isn't a story we're telling you happened. This is a story happening as we publish this video. The empire belongs to Charlie Ergen, and the irony sitting underneath this entire collapse is hard to overstate. The same company that once got rich by disrupting an entrenched, expensive incumbent is now being taken apart by an entrenched incumbent's worst nightmare. Someone doing to them exactly what they once did to cable. The original disruptor. In 1980, Charlie Ergen, his wife Candy, and a friend named Jim DeFranco started EchoStar, selling large satellite dishes out of a truck to rural households cable companies had never bothered to reach. By 1996, EchoStar had turned that idea into Dish Network, an 18-inch satellite dish priced roughly $100 cheaper than its biggest rival, offering multi-channel TV to millions of people cable had left behind. It worked. Dish grew into one of the largest pay TV providers in the country, and Ergen built an empire around it. Sling TV, Boost Mobile, and Hughes, a satellite broadband arm serving rural internet customers the same way Dish once served rural TV customers. For decades, this company's entire identity was built on being the disruptor, the cheaper, scrappier alternative to an entrenched giant. Cracks in 3 places. On June 30th, 2026, 2 pieces of that empire, Dish DBS, which runs the Dish TV and Sling TV business, and Dish Wireless, which holds EchoStar's 5G network, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy together, with the support of creditors holding the vast majority of their debt. Then, just over a month later, on August 2nd, 2026, a 3rd piece of the empire followed. Hughes, the satellite broadband arm, filed its own Chapter 11 case. It had $1.5 billion in bonds come due on August 1st and only about $100 million in cash on hand to cover it. 3 related but legally separate companies, all controlled by the same person, all filing for bankruptcy within about 5 weeks of each other. That's not a coincidence. That's the sound of one strategy failing across an entire portfolio at once, the new disruptor. Here's why it's failing. Hughes' own restructuring officer said plainly, in court filings, that the broadband market is shifting from old-style satellites, parked in a fixed orbit far above Earth, to new constellations of small satellites orbiting much closer, offering faster speeds and lower latency. He named the companies driving that shift directly: SpaceX's Starlink and Amazon's new LEO network. The numbers tell the rest. Hughes lost about 22% of its broadband subscribers in a single year. It reported $1.4 billion in revenue for 2025 and a $1.3 billion net loss in the same year. This is a company whose core business, the thing it was actually founded to do, has been outpaced by exactly the kind of newer, cheaper, more convenient technology that Ergen himself once used to outpace cable. What's actually disputed? To be fair and accurate here, not everything about this story is settled fact. A group of Hughes' bondholders sent the company a formal notice in July, alleging fraudulent transfers and breaches of fiduciary duty related to how the company had been run. Hughes has pushed back firmly, stating through its restructuring officer that it rejects any suggestion those claims have merit. That dispute hasn't been resolved by a court, and we're not going to pretend it has. It's part of what makes this story unfinished. What we don't know yet. Here's what's still genuinely up in the air. Hughes says it intends to keep serving customers while shifting its focus toward enterprise, government, and defense contracts instead of competing directly for everyday consumers. Essentially retreating from the fight it's losing to Starlink and Amazon, rather than continuing to fight it head-on. Whether that pivot works is an open question. Dish TV, Sling TV, and Boost Mobile aren't part of this particular bankruptcy and continue operating for now, though they're sitting inside the same wounded company. Nobody outside this story yet knows whether this ends in a leaner, surviving business, a slow wind down, or something else entirely. The pattern, so far. We can't give you a tidy lesson for a story that hasn't ended. But the pattern already visible here is worth sitting with. Every disruptor in this channel's story bank eventually became an incumbent themselves. And incumbents have a specific blind spot. It's not that they fail to notice a new threat. It's that the muscle memory of having once been the scrappy underdog can make it harder to believe you could ever become the entrenched giant somebody else is coming for. We'll come back to this story once it's actually finished, once we know whether Hughes survives in a smaller form or doesn't survive at all. For now, consider this the pattern catching itself in the middle of repeating. Subscribe if you want to see the pattern before it repeats. Sears didn't die because of Amazon. It didn't die because of a recession or bad luck or a missed deal. Sears died because its own CEO turned every department inside the company into a separate business, competing against each other for money and survival, inside the same stores under the same name. Picture a basketball team where a hedge fund manager buys the franchise and decides each player's salary should be based only on the points they personally score. Not team wins, not assists, just individual stats. You'd expect exactly what actually happened at Sears. Players stop passing the ball. Nobody wants to set up a teammate for an easy shot if it doesn't count toward their own number. The team starts losing badly, even though every single player is trying as hard as they can for themselves. That wasn't a hypothetical at Sears. That was the actual management plan. The hedge fund takeover. In 2005, hedge fund manager Eddie Lampert engineered a $12 billion merger between Kmart, which he already controlled after steering it out of its own bankruptcy, and Sears, at the time a struggling but far from dying department store chain. Lampert had made his fortune running ESL Investments, and he'd built a reputation as one of the sharpest minds on Wall Street. Some called him the next Warren Buffett. The new company, Sears Holdings, made him one of the most closely watched executives in America, and investors expected his financial instincts to do for a 120-year-old retailer what they'd done for his hedge fund. He didn't run Sears like a retailer. He ran it like a stock portfolio, dozens of businesses under one roof, each one expected to justify its own existence, competing for his attention and his money. 30 companies wearing one name. In 2008, Lampert took that portfolio mindset to its logical extreme. He split Sears into more than 30 separate internal units: appliances, tools, apparel, real estate, marketing, human resources, even IT, and gave each one its own president, its own board, and its own profit and loss statement. Lampert was an outspoken admirer of Ayn Rand and her philosophy of rational self-interest, known as objectivism, and he believed that if every unit inside Sears acted purely in its own self-interest, competing hard against each other, the company as a whole would come out ahead. If a division wanted help from human resources or the IT department, it had to negotiate a contract and pay for it, or go find a cheaper option outside the company entirely. Divisions weren't colleagues anymore. They were internal customers and vendors, billing each other, and every single one of them was being measured on their own bottom line, not on whether Sears as a whole was winning. Every division for itself. Here's what that actually looked like on the ground. Sears' appliance division discovered it could make more money selling Samsung and other outside brands than selling Sears' own trusted Kenmore appliances because of how the internal pricing worked. So the appliance division started giving better shelf space and bigger displays to their outside competitors over their own in-house brand. Sears was quietly outcompeting itself in its own stores. The tool brand, Craftsman, refused to pay extra internal fees to the battery brand Die Hard. So the two literally stopped promoting each other. Two products that had shared a Sears aisle for decades, now acting like strangers. Divisions competed for space in the same advertising circulars, and whichever division paid the most internally won the placement, regardless of what actually made sense. One Mother's Day, circular ended up featuring a boy's mini bike on the cover because that division had outbid the others, not because anyone thought that was the smart way to sell Mother's Day gifts. No single division wanted to offer a discount to bring shoppers into the store either, the kind of loss leader pricing that had brought people through Sears doors for generations. A cheap, heavily discounted item near the entrance costs one division money on paper, even if it fills the whole store with customers who end up buying from every other department. Under the new system, that trade-off made no sense to any single division, so nobody did it. Cooperation had no accounting line. Only individual performance did. While the building burned. The human cost inside Sears headquarters was just as real as the strategic one. Employees described a workplace consumed by internal turf wars, where colleagues undercut each other because their bonuses depended on it. In 2012, Sears Holdings was ranked the 6th worst place to work in America. That same year, Lampert closed 1,200 stores and laid off tens of thousands of workers, and bought himself a $40 million home in Florida. Even Lampert's own communication style reflected the culture he'd built. Reports at the time described him posting under a fake name on the company's internal social network, sparring anonymously with employees rather than leading them directly. When a company spokesperson was later asked to defend the infighting, he told a reporter that the clashes for resources were simply healthy competition, the kind of thing, in his words, sorely lacking in socialist economies. A retail company that once defined middle-class American shopping was, by its own spokesman's account, worried about becoming too cooperative. Was it really the structure? Here's a fair objection. Department stores were struggling everywhere in this era. Amazon was rising fast. Malls were emptying out. Maybe Sears was simply a dinosaur that Eddie Lampert's strategy didn't kill. It just failed to save. There's real truth in that. But the timing and the comparison to its peers tell a sharper story. Sears' revenue dropped nearly 40% in the years after the internal competition model took hold, a far steeper collapse than most of its department store peers experienced over the same stretch. Walmart, facing the exact same rise of Amazon and the same shift away from malls, kept every part of its business coordinated under one strategy instead of pitting departments against each other, and kept growing while Sears collapsed. Competing retailers dealing with identical external pressures didn't restructure themselves into 30 warring internal companies. Sears did that to itself, on top of everything the market was already throwing at it. What's left? Sears filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in October 2018, with debts it could no longer manage, and a brand that had spent a decade fighting itself instead of its competitors. In the years around the bankruptcy, the company sold off Craftsman to Stanley Black & Decker, sold Die Hard to Advance Auto Parts, and sold Land's End entirely. The same internal brands that had once refused to cooperate with each other, piece by piece, just to raise cash. Eddie Lampert's own investment firm then bought what remained of Sears out of bankruptcy for close to $5 billion, keeping the lights on in a shrinking handful of stores under a new holding company. Today, Sears operates only a handful of stores in the entire country, down from more than 3,500 locations at its peak between Sears and Kmart combined, back when the two chains together employed hundreds of thousands of people. The divisions that once refused to help each other are now, in most cases, simply gone. There was nothing left to compete over. The lesson. Competition isn't the villain of this story. Every company on this channel operates inside a competitive market, and most of them do it just fine. The villain here is more specific. The belief that competition works just as well inside a company as it does between companies. That if you make every department fight for itself, the whole organization automatically gets stronger. It doesn't. A company isn't a marketplace of strangers. It's a team that already agreed to share a name, a building, and a customer. The moment you make every department treat every other department like a competitor, you haven't created healthy competition. You've just given everyone a reason not to pass the ball. Next time, a beloved company that also let itself get pulled in a dozen directions at once, chasing theme parks, clothing lines, and video games until it nearly disappeared entirely. Unlike this one, somebody caught it in time and saved it by going back to the one thing it always did best. Subscribe if you want to see the pattern before it repeats. In December 2009, Domino's Pizza did something almost no company had ever done deliberately. It stood up in a national ad campaign and told customers correctly that its own pizza was bad. Since that decision, Domino's stock has returned more than 7,700%. For one stretch, it was the second best performing stock in the entire market, ahead of Amazon, ahead of Apple. This isn't just a story about honesty winning people over, though it did. It's a story about what honesty needs sitting next to it before it actually works, and about what happens even to a genuinely great turnaround once enough time goes by. Last place by every measure. By 2008, Domino's Pizza was, by almost any outside measurement, the worst option in its own category. One industry survey ranked it behind Pizza Hut, behind Papa John's, and behind frozen supermarket pizza. Internal focus groups. Domino's ran on itself came back brutal. The crust tasted like cardboard. The sauce tasted like ketchup. One comment called the whole thing a boring, artificial imitation of what pizza could be. Another reviewer, asked to compare it to something, said microwave pizza was better. The recipe itself hadn't meaningfully changed in decades, even as competitors kept improving. The company's stock reflected the neglect, falling to about $2 a share by November 2008. A company nobody expected much from, making a product nobody particularly liked, sliding toward irrelevance in an industry it had once helped define. We screwed up. Most companies in that position do the same thing. Quietly reformulate the product, then launch a new and improved campaign, and hope nobody asks too many questions. Domino's, under then-President Patrick Doyle, did the opposite. In December 2009, it released a 4-minute documentary-style commercial in which its own executives and chefs sat in a conference room and read real customer complaints out loud, on camera, unscripted. There was no actor, no soft focus apology set to gentle music. Doyle didn't hide from it. He appeared in the ad himself and said plainly that it was time to change. Inside the company's Ann Arbor offices, the harshest of those printed reviews had been posted on the walls, so no employee working on the fix could avoid seeing exactly what customers actually thought. Doyle later described the team working nights and weekends to get the new recipe right, treating the criticism less like an insult to survive and more like a to-do list to work through. The part that made the apology real. Here's the detail that separates this from every failed corporate apology you've ever rolled your eyes at. Domino's didn't just say sorry and hope goodwill carried them. The recipe overhaul happened at the same time as the apology, not after it. Chefs tested 10 different crusts and 15 different sauces before landing on a new formula. The new pizza launched the same week the documentary ad aired, so customers watching the apology could taste the fix immediately rather than being asked to trust a promise. That timing is the actual mechanism here, and it's easy to miss. An apology by itself is just marketing. A real product fixed by itself is just an operational change nobody outside the company notices. Put both in front of the customer at the exact same moment, and the apology becomes proof instead of a promise. The bounce. The response was immediate. In the first quarter of 2010, Domino's same-store sales in the U.S. jumped 14.3%. At the time, one of the largest quarterly gains any major fast food chain had ever posted. The stock rose about 130% over the course of that single year. Doyle was named CEO in 2010, and by year's end, the company had crossed nearly $7 billion in total sales, with same-store sales up almost 10% for the full year. The quiet second transformation. Here's where the popular version of this story usually stops, and where the real story keeps going. The apology explains 2010. It doesn't explain the entire decade that followed, during which Domino's kept climbing to become one of the best-performing stocks on the entire market. Adjusted earnings per share rising from under $1 to nearly $10 a share within 10 years. What actually drove that second longer wave wasn't the apology. It was that Domino's quietly turned itself into a technology company that happened to sell pizza. It built a real-time order tracker customers could watch on their phones, showing the exact moment their pizza went in the oven and left for delivery. It built ordering tools that worked through texting, smart speakers, even social media, so placing an order took seconds instead of a phone call. Today, the company invests over $200 million a year in its own technology infrastructure, a bigger and steadier commitment than most restaurant chains ever make. The honesty campaign got people to give Domino's a second look in 2010. The technology is what kept them ordering, without friction, for the decade after. Even this has a shelf life. It would be a tidy ending to say Domino's fixed itself forever. The real current picture is more honest than that. As of 2025, Domino's growth has slowed noticeably, even though the company keeps taking market share from Pizza Hut and Papa John's every single year. The reason isn't a return of bad pizza. It's that third-party delivery apps like DoorDash and Uber Eats now deliver almost every restaurant in America to almost every customer's door. Competition for delivery that essentially didn't exist a decade ago. Domino's spent a decade building one of the best delivery and ordering systems in the industry, and a new layer of competitors just made that advantage available to every other restaurant chain at once. Domino's hasn't collapsed. It's still gaining ground on its direct competitors, and investors have noticed that its stock has held up far better than most of the rest of its industry. But the company that once turned total honesty into total dominance is now facing the same lesson every company on this channel eventually runs into. No fix, however real, buys you permanent immunity from the next disruption. Here's the detail that should make you feel a little more confident about this specific company, though. In August 2026, Domino's ran a campaign paying customers $5 off their next order to beta test a newly redesigned website and app, explicitly asking for blunt feedback rather than assuming the redesign is already right. It's the same instinct as 2009, aimed at a different problem. Don't guess what's wrong. Ask, pay attention, and let the answer be uncomfortable if it needs to be. The lesson. An apology only works when it costs something real and arrives with something real attached to it. Domino's didn't just say the right words. It changed the actual recipe on the same day it admitted the old one was wrong. So, customers didn't have to take the company's word for it. They could taste it. That's the difference between an apology that rebuilds trust and one that just manages a headline for a news cycle. The second lesson is quieter, and it's the one worth sitting with the longest. Even a genuinely earned turnaround has an expiration date. Domino's did almost everything right for over a decade, and the market still found a new way to make that advantage smaller. Being right once isn't a subscription. It's a single payment that eventually runs out. Next time, a company that got a second chance most companies never get. Regulators stepped in specifically to keep it independent and protect its low prices. And it still couldn't survive on its own. Subscribe if you want to see the pattern before it repeats. Blockbuster didn't die because it refused to change. It did change, and for a while, Blockbuster actually won. It built something that was beating Netflix at its own game, growing faster, scaring Netflix's own founder.
Blockbuster could have wiped us out many times. They saddled them with $1 billion of debt as their goodbye kiss. And that the covenants on that debt severely limited Blockbuster when they attacked us.
Then Blockbuster's own board tore that program apart, on purpose, in a fight over one executive's bonus. This isn't a story about a company too slow to see the future. It's a story about a company that saw it, built it, and then watched its own leadership destroy it from the inside, while the future was still winning. The laugh everyone remembers. You probably already know this part. In 2000, Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph flew to Dallas and pitched Blockbuster's CEO, John Antioco, on a partnership. Netflix would run Blockbuster's online business, Blockbuster would keep the stores, and the whole thing would cost Blockbuster $50 million. Netflix had 300,000 subscribers and wasn't profitable. Blockbuster had 9,000 stores and $6 billion a year in revenue. Antioco turned them down. By most accounts, Blockbuster's team barely kept a straight face in the meeting. That story gets told at every business conference because it's a perfect punchline. Giant laughs off tiny startup destroys giant roll credits. It's also, by itself, not what actually killed Blockbuster. Blockbuster had 6 more years after that meeting. And there was a second problem sitting quietly underneath the whole decade. In 2004, Blockbuster's parent company Viacom spun it off carrying $905 million in debt, taken on specifically to pay a dividend back to Viacom shareholders. That debt didn't build a single store or fund a single innovation. It just sat there, making every future decision more expensive than it needed to be. What Blockbuster did next, with the years it had left and the debt weighing it down, is the part of the story that usually gets left out. The comeback nobody talks about. Here's the part almost nobody tells you. Blockbuster figured it out. Antioco spent roughly $200 million eliminating late fees, the single most hated feature of renting from Blockbuster. It was also the exact complaint that had pushed Hastings to start Netflix in the first place. On top of that, Antioco spent several $100 million more building an online arm called Blockbuster Online. In 2006, the two merged into something called Total Access. Rent online, return by mail, or drop it at any store and walk out with your next movie the same day. It combined the one thing Netflix couldn't offer, a physical store on nearly every corner in America. With the convenience that made Netflix dangerous in the first place. It worked, and it worked fast. Total Access hit 2 million subscribers within about a year and a half. Adding subscribers faster than Netflix itself was adding them. Netflix's stock dropped on the news. Reed Hastings later admitted he was scared of it, the founder of the company that eventually won this war, saying that out loud about a competitor, most people assume he crushed without breaking a sweat. Sit with that. The startup everyone assumes crushed Blockbuster from day one was, at one point, genuinely afraid Blockbuster was about to beat it at its own game. The bonus fight. This is where the story turns, and it has nothing to do with Netflix at all. Fixing Blockbuster wasn't cheap. all that spending on late fees and online infrastructure was cutting hard into short-term profits, and one investor didn't like what he was seeing. Carl Icahn was an activist investor, meaning he bought a stake in Blockbuster specifically to push the company to change how it was run. He built up his position and started pushing back, arguing. The spending was reckless. The fight escalated into something almost absurdly small for what was at stake: a dispute over Antioco's bonus. Icahn used it as leverage. In 2007, with the board's confidence gone, Antioco walked away, reportedly with an exit package worth around $9 million. He gave a chunk of the bonus itself to charity on his way out. A fight over one man's paycheck ended the one strategy that was actually beating Netflix. The man who built the only thing that had ever made Netflix nervous left the building with a severance check, while the program he built was still growing. Here's the detail that makes this genuinely painful. Years later, Carl Icahn himself admitted he wasn't sure the fight had been worth it. He later wrote that he still didn't know what would have happened if the blow-up over Antioco's bonus had never occurred and Total Access had simply kept growing, and that things might have turned out very differently. The activist investor who helped end the one strategy that was actually working spent the years afterward wondering on the record whether he'd made a mistake. The undo. His replacement was Jim Keyes, an executive who'd spent his career running 7-Eleven, not building technology or fighting off a streaming disruptor. Keyes didn't tweak Total Access. He gutted it, slashing its marketing budget, raising prices for online subscribers, and steering the company's money and attention back toward physical stores, the part of the business he actually understood. The subscriber growth that had genuinely rattled Netflix stalled almost immediately. By 2008, Netflix had passed 8 million subscribers. Redbox, a company renting DVDs out of dollar-a-night vending kiosks in grocery stores, had over 12,000 locations nationwide. Keyes told an interviewer that neither company was even on his radar as competition. 2 years before Blockbuster's bankruptcy, the man running the company said out loud that the two companies actively killing his industry weren't threats worth worrying about. In 2010, on the way down, Blockbuster brought back the late fees it had spent $200 million killing. The empire that fits in one store. The 2008 financial crisis hit right as Blockbuster's debt came due, and there was no more room to maneuver. In September 2010, Blockbuster filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy with roughly $1 billion in debt. Dish Network picked up what remained for a fraction of that a year later. By 2014, the last corporate-owned stores were gone. Was it really the bonus fight? Here's a fair objection. Maybe none of this mattered, because the $905 million in debt from the 2004 spin-off was always going to sink Blockbuster eventually. Boardroom fight or not, there's something to that. Debt that heavy makes every subsequent decision harder to survive. But it doesn't explain the timing. Total Access was working while that debt existed. The company was closing the gap on Netflix with the debt already on the books. The debt made Blockbuster fragile. The boardroom fight is what actually broke it. Today, exactly one Blockbuster store still operates in the entire world. A franchise location in Bend, Oregon, kept alive mostly as a nostalgia attraction. Netflix, the company Blockbuster once had genuinely scared, now has over 270 million subscribers worldwide and is worth well over $250 billion. Once, Blockbuster had 9,000 stores and beat Netflix at Netflix's own game for a stretch. Now it fits inside a single building people visit to take pictures. The lesson. The version of this story everyone already knows, dumb executives laughed off a $50 million deal, makes it sound like Blockbuster's failure was a failure of imagination. It wasn't. Blockbuster imagined the future just fine. It built the future. For a moment, it was winning the future, faster than the company that eventually inherited it. What killed Blockbuster wasn't a failure to see where things were going. It was a company that built the right answer and then let an internal power struggle over money, over ego, over one man's bonus, undo it before it could finish the job. The threat from outside the building didn't get them. The fight inside the building did. Here's the uncomfortable question worth asking about any organization, including your own. What happens when the thing that's actually working is also expensive, unpopular inside the company, or tied to one person's job? Blockbuster proves the answer isn't obvious. Sometimes the thing that's winning gets killed by the people who are supposed to be protecting it. And the outside competitor just has to wait. Next time, a company that wasn't killed by a competitor or a recession or a missed deal. It was killed by its own CEO's theory about how people inside a company should treat each other. Subscribe if you want to see the pattern before it repeats. Toys R Us generated $11 billion in annual revenue. In 2017, it liquidated, leaving 33,000 employees unemployed. The owners? They walked away with hundreds of millions in fees. The bankruptcy wasn't a failure of management. It was the intended outcome of the business model. That's not irony. That's a private equity trap. This isn't a story about a toy store failing to compete with Amazon. It's a story about a company that was never the point. The deal. In 2005, Toys R Us was a struggling but still profitable retailer, over $11 billion a year in revenue, just not growing the way Wall Street wanted. Three buyers stepped in: the private equity firms KKR and Bain Capital, and the real estate giant Vornado Realty Trust. Together, they paid $6.6 billion for the company. Here's the detail that matters more than the price tag. Of that $6.6 billion, the three buyers only put up about $1.3 billion of their own money. The rest, roughly $5.3 billion, was borrowed. And here's the part that should stop you cold. That debt wasn't borrowed by KKR, Bain, or Vornado. It was loaded onto Toys R Us itself. Picture buying a house with almost no money down, then handing the mortgage bill to the house. The machine. This is the part most retellings of this story skip, and it's the actual engine of the whole thing. Once the deal closed, Toys R Us wasn't just running toy stores anymore. It was running toy stores while also paying out somewhere around $400 to $500 million a year in new debt payments. Money it hadn't owed the week before the buyout. That debt didn't build a single new store or fund a single new product line. It existed purely because of how the deal was financed. Then, there's the part that sounds almost unbelievable the first time you hear it. On top of those debt payments, Toys R Us also paid its own new owners a separate set of fees every year just for owning it. These were real invoices sent from KKR, Bain, and Vornado to the company they had just bought for advisory and management services. The company was basically billed for the experience of being bought. None of this required the stores to succeed. The fees got paid whether sales were up or down. The interest got paid whether the toy business was healthy or not. Over the years that followed, Toys R Us paid out roughly $183 million in advisory fees alone, split more or less evenly between the three owners. That's on top of the debt payments, on top of whatever the stores were actually earning that year. Sit with what that arrangement actually means. KKR, Bain, and Vornado had built a structure where they got paid for owning Toys R Us, long before anyone found out if that was even a good idea. It's the equivalent of a landlord charging you rent to live in an apartment, then also charging you a separate fee just for the paperwork of being your landlord. Every single year, regardless of whether the building is falling apart. This is the trick sitting at the center of the whole story. In a deal built like this, the company doesn't have to succeed for the deal to succeed. The debt isn't a risk the owners are taking on. It's a bill handed to someone else, with the owners collecting a fee just for arranging the handoff. Whether Toys R Us thrived or slowly bled out over the next decade barely changed what KKR, Bain, and Vornado were owed in the meantime. The bleed. Meanwhile, the actual business was quietly starving. Hundreds of millions of dollars a year that could have gone into stores, into competing with a fast-growing Amazon, into the website that a toy retailer in the 2000s and 2010s desperately needed, went to those debt payments and fees instead. You can guess what that trade-off looked like on the ground. Stores that fell behind on renovations, an online experience that never caught up to competitors, a company perpetually one step slower than it needed to be. Not because nobody at Toys R Us saw the problem, because the money that would have fixed it had somewhere else to go first. Twice, between 2010 and 2013, the owners tried to take the company public again. A chance to cash out at a profit and hand the debt problem to public shareholders instead. Both attempts failed. Investors could see the same money troubles employees were living with every day. By the time Amazon had fully rewired how people bought everything, including toys, Toys R Us had spent over a decade with a smaller and smaller share of its own revenue actually available to fight back with. It wasn't that nobody at the company understood e-commerce was coming. It's that the company never had the money to take it seriously, not since the day the buyout closed. Debt or disruption? Here's a fair objection, and it's worth addressing directly instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Some finance researchers argue the real killer wasn't the debt at all. It was Amazon, and the debt just removed any cushion the company had left to survive that fight. Companies survive bankruptcy and restructuring all the time. Toys R Us's core problem, this argument goes, was a retail business that had stopped adapting. That's not wrong. But it's not the whole picture either. A company with $5 billion less debt and the same Amazon problem has options. Renegotiate leases, invest in e-commerce, take a real swing at reinvention. A company already sending $400 million a year out the door before it even opens its doors has none of those options left. The debt didn't cause the disruption. It made sure there was no way to survive it. And once you see exactly where that money went instead, the whole thing gets a lot harder to defend. The payout. Here's where the story stops being about a company at all. When the buyout closed in 2005, the outgoing CEO walked away with a payout of over $65 million. Over the 12 years that followed, KKR, Bain, and Vornado collected roughly $460 to $470 million, combined in fees and interest from the company they owned. Money that came directly out of Toys R Us, the same company that couldn't find $400 million a year to modernize its stores or build a real online business. When the bankruptcy finally came in 2017, the owner's original $1.3 billion, their own money, was effectively wiped out. On paper, that's a failure. On a spreadsheet somewhere at each of these firms, it's a loss they can write off. But the fees were already collected. The interest was already paid. Whatever that money was worth at the end, the machine had already extracted its return on the way there. Compare that to what didn't happen to the 33,000 employees who lost their jobs in the liquidation. There was no fee structure protecting them on the way down. There was no guaranteed payment regardless of outcome. They were exposed to the exact risk the owners had engineered themselves out of. The lesson. Most of the companies on this channel died because someone made the wrong bet and the market punished them for it. Toys R Us is different, and that's what makes it worth understanding. The people who controlled the company weren't betting on Toys R Us succeeding. They built a structure where they got paid on the way in, kept getting paid the whole way through, and only risked the part of their money that was already the smallest slice of the deal. The lesson isn't just debt is dangerous, though it clearly is. It's this. Before you assume everyone in a deal is rowing in the same direction, check who gets paid regardless of the outcome and who only gets paid if it works. Those are two very different games being played at the same table, wearing the same jersey. Toys R Us didn't die because nobody saw Amazon coming. It died with a bill already fully paid to the people who were supposed to be steering it away from the iceberg. Next time, a company that had the winning hand sitting right in front of it turned it down on purpose and then spent the next decade insisting the game hadn't changed. Subscribe if you want to see the pattern before it repeats.